This is part 3 of America's Two Just Wars, 1775 and 1861, by Rothbard. I want to now return to America's two just wars. It is plainly evident that the American Revolution, using my definition, was a just war. A war of peoples forming an independent nation and casting off the bonds of another people, insisting on perpetuating their rule over them. Obviously, the Americans, while welcoming French or other support, were prepared to take on the daunting task of overthrowing the rule of the most powerful empire on earth, and to do it alone if necessary. What I want to focus on here is not the grievances that led the American rebels to the view that it had become necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another. What I want to stress here is the ground on which the Americans stood for this solemn and fateful act of separation. The Americans were steeped in the natural law philosophy of John Locke and the Scholastics, and in the classical republicanism of Greece and Rome. There were two major political theories in Britain and in Europe during this time. One was the older, but by this time obsolete, absolutist view. The king was the father of his nation, and absolute obedience was owed to the king by the lesser orders. Any rebellion against the king was equivalent to Satan's rebellion against God. The other natural law view countered that sovereignty originated not in the king, but in the people, but that the people had delegated their powers and rights to the king. Hugo Grotius and conservative natural lawyers believed that the delegation of sovereignty, once transferred, was irrevocable, so that sovereignty must reside permanently in the king. The more radical libertarian theorists, such as Father Mariana and John Locke and his followers, believed, quite sensibly, that since the original delegation was voluntary and contractual, the people had the right to take back that sovereignty should the king grossly violate his trust. The American revolutionaries, in separating themselves from Great Britain and forming their new nation, adopted the Lockean doctrine. In fact, if they hadn't done so, they would not have been able to form their new nation. It is well known that the biggest moral and psychological problem the Americans had, and could only bring themselves to overcome after a full year of bloody war, was to violate their oaths of allegiance to the British king. Breaking with the British Parliament, their de facto ruler, posed no problem. Parliament they didn't care about. But the king was their inherited sovereign lord, the person to whom they had all sworn fealty. It was the king to whom they owed allegiance. Thus, the list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence mentioned only the king, even though Parliament was in reality the major culprit. Hence, the crucial psychological importance to the American revolutionaries of Thomas Paine's common sense, which not only adopted the Lockean view of a justified reclaiming of sovereignty by the American people, but also particularly zeroed in on the office of the king. In the words of the New Left, Paine delegitimized and desanctified the king in American eyes. "The king of Great Britain," Paine wrote, "is only the descendant of nothing better than the principal ruffian of some restless gang, whose savage manner or preeminence in subtlety obtained him the title of chief among plunderers." And now, the kings, including the royal brute of Great Britain, are but crowned ruffians. In making their revolution, then, the Americans cast their lot permanently, with a contractual theory or justification for government. Government is not something imposed from above, by some divine act of conferring sovereignty, but contractual, from below, by consent of the governed. That means that American polities inevitably become republics, not monarchies. What happened, in fact, is that the American Revolution resulted in something new on Earth. The people of each of the 13 colonies formed new, separate, contractual republican governments. Based on libertarian doctrines and on republican models, the people of the 13 colonies each set up independent sovereign states, with powers of each government strictly limited, with most rights and powers reserved to the people, and with checks, balances, and written constitutions severely limiting state power. These 13 separate republics, in order to wage their common war against the British Empire, each sent representatives to the Continental Congress and then later formed a confederation, again with severely limited central powers, to help fight the British. The hotly contested decision to scrap the Articles of Confederation and to craft a new constitution demonstrates conclusively that the central government was not supposed to be perpetual, not to be the sort of permanent one-way trap that Grotius had claimed turned popular sovereignty over to the king forevermore. In fact, it would be very peculiar to hold that the American revolutionaries had repudiated the idea that a pledge of allegiance to the king was contractual and revocable, and break their vows to the king, only to turn around a few short years later to enter a compact that had turned out to be an irrevocable one-way ticket for a permanent central government power. Revocable and contractual to a king, but irrevocable to some piece of paper. And finally, does anyone seriously believe for 1 minute that any of the 13 states would have ratified the Constitution had they believed that it was a perpetual one-way Venus flytrap, a one-way ticket to sovereign suicide? The Constitution was barely ratified as it is. So, if the Articles of Confederation could be treated as a scrap of paper, if delegation to the Confederate government in the 1780s was revocable, how could the central government set up under the Constitution less than a decade later claim that its powers were permanent and irrevocable? Sheer logic insists that if a state could enter a confederation, it could later withdraw from it. The same must be true for a state adopting the Constitution. And yet, of course, that monstrous illogic is precisely the doctrine proclaimed by the North, by the Union, during the war between the states. In 1861, the Southern states, believing correctly that their cherished institutions were under grave threat and assault from the federal government, decided to exercise their natural, contractual, and constitutional right to withdraw, to secede from that union. The separate Southern states then exercised their contractual right as sovereign republics to come together in another confederation, the Confederate States of America. If the American Revolutionary War was just, then it follows, as the night the day, that the Southern cause, the war for Southern independence, was just, and for the same reason, casting off the political bonds that connected the two peoples. In neither case was this decision made for light or transient causes, and in both cases, the courageous seceders pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. End of part 3.